Okay guys, so we're back again. Looks like there is a part. What is this? Part 4. This is the concluding final part with a fix with any luck. So what I've been doing, and this has taken a few days because I've needed a cold engine multiple times, I've been mapping the basically I've been feeding the ECU with resistances all the way from 200 ohms, 150 ohms, 100 ohms even, all the way up to 8,500 ohms in 100 ohm increments, and I've been measuring the fuel injection pulse width to graph it. What I'm going to try and do, because there's basically no service information, multiple people now have trawled the internet trying to, I'm sure there's a Japanese guy somewhere that wrote the code and knows about this thing, but there's no information. And as you know from the previous videos, it's under injecting when it's cold. And as I've previously said, I can make it start instantly by increasing the resistance of the engine coolant temperature sensor. The normal range for the coolant temperature sensor, when it's cold, I just measured it, so when it's cold at about, I think it was 15 degrees, it's about 3,100 ohms, and when it's really hot, it's down around 200 ohms. Now, even at the, I'm sure if it got into minus temperatures, it would, that resistance would go up higher. But at the 3,100 ohms, bear with me, I'm getting to a point. At the 3,100 ohm point, which is, you know, engine cold, the engine coolant temperature sensor is telling the ECU, engine cold, got 3,100 ohm resistance through the sensor, so the 5 volt going in, voltage, anyway, let's not go into that. So the ECU should know the engine's cold, but with that sort of resistance at 3,100 ohms, it's still fueling it like the engine's hot. If I wind the resistance up to, and I'll put the graph on the screen, which is quite interesting, if I wind the resistance up to, I forget what it was, I think it was about over 6,000 ohms, then it starts to richen up quite a lot. My thought is, on the wire, either on the 5 volt ref going in, or to the sensor, or the ground, the return, I'm going to put a resistor in series, and if I get the right value, I'm hoping I will tip it over that point, which will make it rich enough to start, but it also won't affect it too badly when the engine's hot. Do you see what I mean? It goes to the other side of that graph I've made, into the portion of the graph where the fueling's correct. And if it's not quite right, we can tune it with a power commander. This is not the best fix, but it's the only fix I can come up with, apart from maybe getting another engine ECU. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find the right wire that I want to put the resistor in. I'm going to cut it. I'm going to solder 2 bits of wire, so I've got 2 spurs coming out. And I'm also going to have one of the fuel injector wires looping out the loom. I'm going to put it all back together neatly. I'm going to bolt all this back together. So I've got it all neat, and I've got 2 wires which I can put the resistor across. And I've got a loop that I can test pulse width on. And I'm going to do a little bit more experimenting with different value resistors and see how it runs. So that's what I'm doing. I'm going to make this neat. Now the next shot will be this all neat with the 2 wires sticking out, and yeah, and the little loop for testing the pulse width. Fucking hell, that was a marathon speech, sorry. Right, onwards. Right, let me try and explain a little bit better what I'm trying to do here. So engine's at 67 degrees. This is the resistance of the coolant temperature sensor on the bike at the moment. So 400 ohms, or 0.4 of a kilo ohm, which is 400 ohms. Oh, look, it's swatted in. I've noticed that. Anyway, so 400-ish ohms. What am I trying to say? Fuck me. Get your thoughts together, Jim, before you actually open your mouth. So if we look at the fuel injection pulse width now, right, so this pulse width, 2.3 milliseconds, has no bearing on the resistance I just showed you, that 300 and something ohms. The thing that's controlling this pulse width is this box. So this box is set to 200 ohms. So what I'm trying to find out from my graph and stuff is, I'm going to get the engine up to temperature now, and I'm going to keep adding resistance and looking. I'm going to keep adding resistance in from that box whilst looking at this pulse width, and I want to find out how high the resistance has got to be before it adversely affects this number, this 3.21 milliseconds. Do you see what I mean? That's the magic. That resistance, when it starts to add fuel, that's the magic number I need to know, because if I can get the lower side of that by adding that resistor and basically have the coolant temperature sensor flip-flop either side of that magic number. Jesus, am I explaining myself? I'm not sure I am. Hopefully it will become more clear as I actually do it. Right, so 80 degrees, and it's getting, let's move this cursor slightly. It's getting 2.2, call it, milliseconds. Now then, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to add some resistance here. So let's put that to 0. Let's go to 1000 ohms, 1 kilo ohm. Start it. Now that number hasn't changed, which is perfect. So I'm going to go up another 500 ohms now. So 1500 ohms. Still hasn't changed, which is good. $2,000 ohms. Pretty much the same. We might be starting to see a slight increase. Let's go to 2,500 ohms. Yeah, I think we're starting to see a tiny increase. Let's try 3,000. Only a tiny smidge. Right, let me shut this bike off. Right, is it starting to make sense? So what I'm trying to do, let's say the magic number is 2,500 ohms. I've got about 2,700 ohms worth of resolution in the sensor. So we're down at, now the engine's hot, we're down at 230. If it gets to about 90 degrees, I think it was at 200 ohms. So if we can figure the maths out correctly, given that we've got, I don't know, let's call it 2,900 ohms worth of resolution in the sensor. When it's hot, we need the resistance below 2,500, and when it's cold, we need the resistance above whatever it was in the graph that makes it go rich. I think it was, standby, let's have a look at the graph. Yeah, so it doesn't start to get significantly richer until the resistance is really, really high. So sort of 8,000 odd ohms. And obviously the resolution we've got in the sensor is less than 3,000, so that would put it above 5,000 ohms, which wouldn't work. But I think if we can flip-flop, if we can go up, what am I trying to say? If the lowest number, if we choose the right resistor, is, let's call it 2,000 ohms for the sake of argument, if we can then add another 2,800, 2,900 ohms, that makes us nearly 5,000 ohms. And according to the measurements I've made, yeah, according to those measurements, that will add Oh, not a lot. About half a milliseconds worth of fuel. Could do with a different coolant temperature sensor with a bigger range. I wonder if that's a thing. That might be a... Anyway, am I making sense what I'm trying to accomplish here? This is a sticking plaster solution. Of course, the other option is to, on that wire that I'm going to put the resistor on, just put a switch. Put like an 8K resistor in the switch. Actually, no, that'd be too high. Maybe a 5K resistor probably would be perfect, and then you could just have a cold start switch, flick the switch, it would start instantly, let it warm up a bit, knock the switch off. Not ideal, shouldn't be that way, but in the absence of another engine ECU, there isn't really much I can do. I did take the ECU apart, I took the cover off. I'll flash a picture on the screen, just to see, you know, I'm reasonably familiar with PCBs and stuff, and you know, I've got a microscope, I can look for knackered components. I'm not an electronics guy by any stretch of the imagination, but I've got some reasonably good, you know, I can what am I trying to say, I can change components on a board without fucking the board up quite easily, and I just thought, oh, I'll have a look at the board and see if there's, you know, something burnt out somewhere, and just have a poke around with a meter, but it's potted. Have a look at the picture, there's no getting at any of it. Let's get the wiring loom all tidied up. Just leave the wires exposed that I need. Get all the idle mixture adjustment pots back in, get all that tidied up. I'll experiment with some different resistors to see if I can get it to flip-flop either side of the value I need, which is about between 2 and 2,500 K. Basically, when it's cold, needs to be... There's just not enough resolution in the sensor. Sorry, I'm repeating myself probably, but when it's cold, I need about a 6,000 ohm. Yeah, I need about 6,000 ohms, and then when it's hot, I need sort of below 2,000 ideally. I think probably what's going to happen is going to end up with a cold start switch, unless we can find an engine coolant temperature sensor with a bigger resolution in terms of, you know, resistance from min to max. Right, onwards. Interestingly, just starting to tidy up this wiring and identifying which is the wire for the coolant temperature sensor, just so I can put my loop in. That wire at some point in its life has been cut and soldered back together. God, I wish I knew the history of this bike and what's gone on. Isn't that bizarre? Anyway, onwards. Okie dokie. So, I've had to stop my OCD from stripping all this wire and loom and retaping the whole thing, but I've got a loop here. This is 5-volt reference to the sensor. Now, without going down a massive rabbit hole, they're wired slightly differently. Normally you would have, with a modern engine, you'd have a common 5-volt reference going to air temperature, water temperature, TPS, all sorts of different sensors that are feeding information back to the ECU. The ECU would put out a 5-volt reference signal, and then these various sensors would add some resistance, and the ECU would listen to the other wire going back, if you see what I mean. So there'd be a voltage drop across the sensor, and the ECU would monitor that voltage. What's happening with this is you got the 5-volt reference from the ECU to the sensor, the one wire on the sensor. The other sensor wire is a ground, so the sensor's pulling this voltage down to ground. Does that make sense? So you're only going to see 5 volts on here when the engine temperature sensor is disconnected. Anyway, that's not a... I don't want to go into that now. So this is all buttoned up nice and neat. That's all back together as it's going to be. Everything's screwed down. This little loop here is one of the wires, one of the ground side switch wires for the injector, just so I can, without having to lift the tank up, take the airbox off, have a massive fight to take some reference waveforms that can easily be taped into the loom when I'm done. Just makes it easy. So now I can just cut this. I can play around with some different resistors, or I can wire it to a switch which will switch in a resistor to make it start when it's cold. Stand by. A cup of tea is needed, and then I'm going to decide what I'm going to do with this little loopy loop. Okay guys, so this is what I've come up with. So I've got this connector on here, and then its counterpart on the other side. I've soldered in some, I've got a big assortment of resistors. I've chosen 3 values, a 2.1k I think it was, 4.5k and 5.5k. And I've soldered them across the connector. I've also got one that's just got a loop of wire, and I've potted them with a little bit of epoxy resin, and I've even put a little label on them so you can tell which is which. Excelled myself there, I think. So yeah, the idea is I can have a little bit of an experiment now. I'd be interested in, I'm thinking that maybe the 2k resistor might be the sweet spot, which will allow it to be rich enough to start from cold, but it'll allow it to be when all the resistance has come out of the engine coolant temperature sensor, when the engine's hot and it's at sort of 200 ohms. So it'll be 2.2k then, or 2.3k in total. That'll allow it to be in the right bit of the map for normal running. It's going to be a bit of a balancing act, I think, but I've got loads of different values of resistors, so we can have a little bit of an experimentation. But as I've banged on about many times, I think already, you know, it's a sticking plaster solution. Something's going on that I don't understand, and there's no information. And as I think I previously, I opened this up to see what was going on inside, see if I could see any damage to the PCB or a component on the board, but couldn't see anything. Anyway, I'll show you with it probably be tomorrow now, when the engine's nice and cold. We'll experiment with the 3 values of resistors I've got, see how it starts from cold, and see how it runs when it's up to temperature with the 3 different values. Try and come up with a, you know, we'll leave it, hopefully we can just, I'm thinking that probably, as I think I just said, the 2k resistor might be the one, that's the sweet spot, which will, yeah, it'll allow it to be in the bit of the map where it's at sort of 2.2 milliseconds at idle, and it'll be just rich enough to run to start from cold. Anyway, see you in the morning and we'll try it when it's cold. Okie dokie, so it's the next morning. It's about 10 degrees C here in the workshop, so it's reasonably cold. Try and start it. I've got the loopy wire to start with, just to demonstrate that it will not start under normal conditions. Yeah, I've labelled these just for the next poor sod that maybe has to work on it, just so it's not completely confusing. Yeah, so let's try and start it just with a loop of wire, which means on my little graph it's down in the less than 2.5 milliseconds amount of fuel. So yeah, let's try that. Okay, so full choke, no throttle at all. It doesn't want to, if you try and give it throttle, it makes it worse. Interesting observation I discovered as well, which I don't think I've mentioned. I've fucking talked hind legs off this whole thing, I know already, but one thing I did discover while looking at the fuel injection pulse width with a scope is, on initial crank, like the first, must be the first couple of rotations of the crankshaft, it massively over injects, like you'd expect it to when it's cold. It also does it when it's hot though, which I thought was a little bit weird. So you get about that first opening of the injector, you get 5, 6, 7 milliseconds of fuel, which explains why when you initially try and start it, it fires once and then it won't keep going. Now I've see how it's got a tiny bit of warmth in it and it is almost going. That's why I've had to keep going back to this thing cold and leaving it overnight. It's been a bit of a pain. Anyway, so where was I? Get your thoughts together, Jim. It is early and I've only had 1 cup of coffee, so you got to bear with me. I'm going to change the resistor now to, I'm hoping that the 2000 ohm or the 2100 ohm resistor is going to be enough, because it's going to change the map. I'll put it on the screen. So we're down somewhere sort of under 2.5 milliseconds. I know from measuring, the coolant temperature sensor is at about 3,100 ohms when it's the engine's this cold. So if we add the 2,100 ohm resistor to that, we're over 5,000 ohms, and that brings it up to, I think it's close to 3 milliseconds, which might just be enough fuel to get it to go. When the weather gets much colder, that might become an issue. But obviously if I put too big a value of resistor in it, it's then not going to get back down into the bit of the map it needs when it's at temperature, which is going to make it rich. Right, let's swap that resistor. Okay, so this one measured, it's 2.15k. So let's plug that in there. Let's move the camera and let's try and have another go at starting it. Okie dokie. So same as before, full choke. I'm hoping that it's just going to get up on its fast idle on its own, because you don't want to be, it's going to still be a bit lean, but there'll, fingers crossed, there'll be enough fuel for it to run. That is fucking awesome, fair dues. So we're up in that bit of the map. It's probably somewhere near 3 milliseconds of fuel it's getting. And as it, turn it off, as it warms up, it's going to drop back down into the bit of map that it was on anyway, without adding this resistor when it's hot, if that makes sense. So it should run fine when it's hot. I'll probably have a ride on it, although it's a little bit, I'd like to go through the whole thing, make sure it's safe before I ride it, and I haven't really got time for that. But yeah, I think we can consider that a fix. Been round the houses a bit. Around the houses multiple times, but we got there in the end. And if you've watched to the end here, well done to you. You guys say you like me waffling on, but holy shit, I've literally done my own head in, and the edit has been super painful because I've had to watch all this footage back and try and create some sort of narrative and some sort of thread through it. It's not my finest work, this series of videos, really, because I've been a little bit all over the place, but there's valuable information. If you want to sit and listen to me bang on about stuff, then you know there is some stuff to be gleaned from it. Anyway, that's that done, I think. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you on the next one. Right, bonus content. So it's at 92 degrees. I'm hooked up here. It's not the Pico scope this time. This is just my Vantage Pro. Let's get that cursor in the right place. So 2.75 milliseconds with that 2.15k resistor. If I knock it off, I'm going to swap that for the wire. Stand by. Got the wire in there. It's slightly too high, that resistance. What do we get in there? 2.5. Turn this off. So that 2. I don't know whether maybe we could go down to like a 1500 ohm resistor, but we're playing, I think, I mean, I'm done at this point, but I think it's maybe going to end up with a little cold start switch. That's going to be the easiest way of getting around this weird ECU problem. Anyway, that is the end, guys. I just thought I'd show you that little bit at the end. I haven't quite... Yeah. Fuck, that's annoying. I was hoping it would be the resistance once it was hot. Focus. I was hoping the resistance once the engine was hot would be low enough to get it right in that low bit of the map. But it's not quite. Oh, how irritating. Anyway, fucking hell. Stop talking and go and do other work, Jim. See you soon, guys.